Thank you, Mr. President. The Russian delegation asked for the meeting today so as to draw the attention of our colleagues in the Council to the actions and statements which are directly or indirectly underline the prospects for a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis. Such destructive steps are increasing in number recently, and this gives us reason to increasingly doubt the sincerity of those who, from the very beginning, nurtured and armed the Kiev regime to the teeth. We doubt their sincerity that they want to go to close this very dangerous chapter for international peace and security. Many in the West, because of political situations, are putting on the sheep's clothing of diplomacy. The potential of diplomacy is something that we never denied from the very beginning. We didn't do it after the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014, after the Kiev regime's stated goal to eliminate everything Russian, their military activities against their own citizens in the east of Ukraine. Even after that, we agreed with the Minsk package of measures enshrined by Security Resolution 2201. The goal here was not only restoring control by Ukraine over the eastern part of the country, but also a number of very important steps that Kiev had to undertake. As we all know today, the Minsk process from the very inception was considered by the Western sponsors of Kiev as a screen to speed up the arming of Ukraine and prepare Ukraine for the war with Russia. They were encouraged by the idea to use Ukraine as a kind of ram so as to inflict a military defeat on Russia, or at least to bleed it dry. The Western sponsors of Kiev ignored all our appeals to find an mutually acceptable ways of resolving European crisis having to do with the prospects of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, and thus left us no choice but to become the special military operation in February 2022. There was a new chance for diplomacy after the Russian-Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul initialed a peace agreement which could have stopped the military escalation in April 2022 already. Let me recall here that at the time the Russian troops were kilometers away from Kiev and were pulled back exclusively as a goodwill gesture given the progress at the negotiations. It seemed at the time that we had an excellent opportunity to remove this thorn, to save hundreds of thousands of lives and avoid destruction of citizen infrastructure in Ukraine. But the plans of the Western sponsors of Kiev regime did not include reconciling the two neighboring Slavic people who are populated essentially by the same people. Not part of the plan. And that is why London came into the game in the person of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And there was a disgusting and crude provocation organized in Bucha so as to make sure that the world public opinion is against Russia. And everyone started trying to convince Zelensky that with Western support, he will be able to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. As a result, Ukraine continued fighting, setting the Istanbul advances aside. What happened, in actual fact, is the fully scaled proxy aggression by NATO against our country, within which Ukraine is just playing the role of a private military company using Western weapons and defending Western interests. This was a fatal strategic mistake by the Kiev princeling. This is not something that anyone is disputing today. As a result of that, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers died. Russia had to destroy an unprecedented number of Western weapons, destroy military facilities on Ukraine and everything that is Ukraine's military potential. During that time, that country, besides Crimea, which joined Russia immediately after the coup in Kiev in 2014, lost 4 additional regions whose people spoke in favor of joining Russia. What remains of Ukraine today became a corrupt dictatorship of one person in which Ukrainians have no rights and became nothing more than cannon fodder. They are being captured on streets and sent to the front line against their will. This is something that's very difficult to refute, especially if you take into account the facts that we brought in at the previous Security Council meeting on Ukraine, which was a few days ago. The worst thing here is that Ukrainians have completely lost their voice. Otherwise, they would have spoken against continuing the war. But the expired former comedian has no intention of conducting elections because him and his acolytes, according to even the most loyal surveys, have no chance of retaining power if they take place. Now, what is the view of all of this on the part of our Western colleagues who usually are looking for a mote in another's eye when it comes to democracy and human rights? Well, there's no reaction. They're silent and only sometimes bestir themselves when the Zelensky clique went after their own pet pseudo-anti-corruption entities, which are only used as a lever to exert pressure on the Kiev leadership. Otherwise, what you hear in the West about Ukraine is either nothing or very well good things indeed. This brings to mind the words of Andrzej Duda when he said that Ukraine is a drowning man and it pull everyone down with them. And that's exactly what's happening. And what is hitting rock bottom now together with Ukraine is not just the European economy, but also Western values, which are losing their content against the background of such egregious double standards. Mr. President, I think that everyone who is following the development of this crisis noticed that a peaceful tone in the statements of our opponents is something that's miraculously coincide with the depletion of military potential, not only of the Kiev regime, but also of its Western sponsors. Today, the problem is not the resources needed to provide military assistance to Ukraine. Even the NATO countries suffering from their own sanctions against Russia, they could be found. The issue is that the stockpiles, weapons stockpiles are depleted, the kinds of weapons that could be supplied to Ukraine. And the second here is, as I mentioned, Ukrainians no longer want to fight, and putting them into the trenches by force is becoming increasingly difficult. Even if they end up there, people try to use the first opportunity to surrender or flee. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, they are in the numbers of 20,000 per month. So the Ukrainian army is retreating everywhere, especially after the disastrous Kursk misadventure by Ukraine. And this is something that we will be discussing separately at the ARIA Formula meeting in August. Having realized this, the most realistic amongst the sponsors of the Kiev regime had to acknowledge that the Ukrainians do not have on their hands the kinds of cards that could allow them to put forward their own conditions in negotiations, nor will they ever have them, regardless of what efforts are being made. And then these sponsors compelled the Zelensky regime to agree to negotiate with Russia. And this brought back the preconditions for the peaceful solution, and we immediately supported such a scenario. Or better yet, we never moved away from such a scenario. Since the first day, we've been saying that we were ready to attain the special military operations goal, not militarily, but diplomatically. It was after that that the Istanbul negotiating track was resumed, and the third round took place there on the 23rd of July. All of the agreements on the humanitarian tracks, which were discussed earlier, have been implemented. The second huge exchange of POWs, about 1,200 people, has been completed. There is an understanding here that a similar exchange will take place in the very near future. Also, we will continue exchanging the wounded and the ill on the front lines. We give to Kiev 7,000 bodies to the Ukrainians and have 3,000 more ready to give back. We also are putting forward the proposal to have a humanitarian pauses on the front lines. Furthermore, we fully worked through the Kiev list of 339 Ukrainian children we received in Istanbul. Most of them, we realized, were never in our territory, and 50 of them are adults. We also raised the issue about returning the Russian national minors who are still in Ukraine, or the ones who were transferred by Kiev into European countries, and gave them a list with names. We also proposed that the Ukrainian side should consider creating 3 working groups on political, humanitarian, and military issues. And we expect that this initiative will be viewed positively in Kiev. We stand ready to continue work on bringing our positions closer when it comes to the memorandum on the view by Russia and Ukraine of the final resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, which we gave during the second round. In other words, we intend to continue the negotiations in Istanbul. Mr. President, It would seem, therefore, that such developments, when Russia and Ukraine have resumed negotiations in Turkey, should inspire all of our international partners to consider this as a first step towards future agreements, a kind of agreements which would settle the Ukrainian crisis. But despite the meetings in Istanbul, in the West, the war party did not go away, and they're not happy with this scenario. We continue hearing voices of those who think that diplomacy is just a way of criticizing Russia and exerting pressure on it. And what is being imposed on us is something that is not logical within the context of the Ukrainian crisis, namely that the only criteria of Russia's readiness to peace is our agreement with unconditional and lasting ceasefire. Why doesn't it not fit logically? It's because we've already seen this situation when during the Minsk agreements I mentioned. The Western sponsors of Ukraine even not even trying to hide the fact that any pause in fighting will be used to rearm the Ukrainian units, to rotate the personnel, and preventing the Ukrainian army to resume hostilities against Russia. Why do we need such a situation under a condition when the Russian army is moving forward on all fronts and the Ukrainian army is, and their front is either collapsing or is on its last leg? All the more so since the root causes of the crisis is not something that our opponents are trying to eliminate, and those who are helping negotiations are providing us no guarantees of that. We are being pressured to agree to a new Minsk, whereas at the same time the same people are hiding something and are trying to go back to a proxy war against us through Ukraine. Could anyone tell us why we would need this? Why would Ukraine need this, whose people, as I mentioned, don't even have their own voice when it comes to this kind of a scenario of developing events? I will probably surprise some of the colleagues here, but this scenario is not something that our Western colleagues need either, provided, of course, that we assume that their commitment to democratic values, human rights, and fighting corruption is not just empty words. Why do they need to cover up for a regime which is based on a visceral nationalism and xenophobia, which goes back to the infamous history of Hitler's acolytes, who, during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, eliminated thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and Ukrainians? The Polish Sejm stated that 11th July is the day of memory of the victims of the massacre in Volyn, who was done by those who today in Kiev are telling their children that they need to admire these people. Is there no cognitive dissonance here? Do you not have a dissonance between this and multiculturalism and anti-discrimination on the basis of language and nationality? Are you not closing eyes here on the policy to the Kiev regime, trying to burn out everything in Russia? And when I say burn, I mean it literally, because I'm referring to what happened on the 2nd of May in the trade union house in Odessa, when Russian-speaking people in that city were burnt alive only because they wanted to protect the right of their children to speak Russian, have the right to glorify the people who liberated Ukraine from fascism, and not the other way around. Those who protect their faith at home, should they not punish Ukraine, who is persecuting canonical orthodoxy, 1,000-year-old faith, when Ukraine takes away our clergy and churches? When you're protecting Zelensky, you're protecting something that you will never allow yourselves at home. Why are you asking me that we allow ourselves at our own border against people who are speaking our language and have the same faith? How come you have such criminal double standards? Mr. President, we have stated many times that we are not trying to destroy Ukraine, its culture, its identity. We advocate the Ukrainian culture to live as a neighbor with the Russian culture, as it has been done by decades. We're not fighting against Ukrainians. They are brotherly people. We are fighting a criminal Kiev regime, and Ukrainians are becoming clearer and clearer about that. We want to have a border with Ukraine, not with anti-Russia. The United States would never accept a border with something that's anti-American. What is there to denounce? Let's make Ukraine sane again, because after all, this is what you were trying to attain. It's important at the same time to bear in mind one more important aspect without which I don't think Ukrainian settlement would be possible. And once again about hiding something under your coat, which our partners are not even trying very hard. We understand that the Ukrainian crisis is only a function of a much broader crisis, result of long-standing efforts by the West, who ignored Russian security interests. We need to do something here as well, and we hope that those who are reasonable in Europe and America will find something much more positive than another list of sanctions against Russia, something that we have adjusted to a long time ago. Otherwise, the situation in Europe and peace will remain unstable, and we will never be able to break this vicious cycle. So far, what we've heard is just additional frightening statements about Russia preparing an attack in other countries, and this is extremely unreasonable. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we are now having a good moment to try and rectify many mistakes and move on to cooperation. Your decision is yours, but do remember that our national interests, our right to live in peace and not be threatened from our nearest neighbors, is not something we will ever give up on. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Security Council is meant to meet and discuss real problems, threats to international peace and security. And the name of the real problem is written on that country nameplate, Russian Federation. There are no two parties attacking civilians. There is one country, Russia, one problem for peace and security in Ukraine, in our region, and globally. Just last night, on the eve of this meeting, Russia unleashed yet another ruthless assault on Ukraine, with 309 UAVs and 8 cruise missiles from different directions. As of now, 11 people were killed in the attack on Kyiv, with the death toll rising and one child among them. Another 135 civilians were wounded across the capital, including 11 children. Ukraine has requested the presidency to convene a separate Security Council meeting to discuss these real attacks on peace and security. Let us be clear here. Today's meeting, convened at the request of the Russian Federation, is both cynical and morally repugnant. The very state that launched the largest war of aggression in Europe since the World War II now attempts to portray itself as a victim of so-called Western interference. This is not only a grotesque distortion of reality, which is used by the Russian state for years, it is also an insult to the multilateralism, to the United Nations, to the principles enshrined in Charter, to all of you, distinguished members of the Security Council. But above all, to the memory of the tens of thousands of Ukrainians who were killed as a result of Russia's war of aggression. We should make no mistake, Russia has no genuine interest in peace. If it did, it could end its war at any moment. But instead, it continues to pursue conquest, domination, and the total destruction of a sovereign state, Ukraine. Let us also recall the basics. In this century alone, Russia has invaded Ukraine twice. First in 2014 with the illegal occupation of Crimea and parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Then again in 2022 when it launched a full-scale war of aggression. These actions represent blatant violations of the UN Charter and the core principles of international law. You all agree to that. At this very moment, Russia is still trying to illegally occupy more Ukrainian territory. It bombs cities, targets civilian infrastructure, kills innocent people every single day. It has staged sham referenda, denied Ukraine's sovereignty, and works openly to erase our independence and statehood. And yet, while committing these egregious violations, it dares to accuse others of undermining peace. Mr. President, simultaneously, the Kremlin continues to fuel its war of aggression and draw other actors into its campaign of terror. Since 2022, Iran has supplied the Russian Federation with hundreds of unmanned aerial vehicles, flagrantly violating Security Council Resolution 2231, while its restrictions remained in force. This impunity for gross violations of international law by both Russia and Iran has emboldened others, particularly the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, to exploit the situation and advance their own destabilizing agendas. Since 2023, the regimes in Moscow and Pyongyang have significantly deepened their military and military technical cooperation, including unlawful arms transfers and the reported deployment of North Korean military personnel in support of Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. Russia's war machine is now being sustained by Iran and the DPRK in direct violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and the foundational norms of international law. It receives drones, missiles, and ammunition from these regimes, as well as dual-use goods and equipment supplied by Chinese companies. This enables Moscow to prolong its war and escalate the suffering of our people. We continue to recover foreign manufactured components from Russian missiles and drones used to strike our civilian infrastructure. This stark reality highlights the urgent need for coordinated international action to halt the flow of materials and technologies that fuel Russia's armed aggression. Mr. President, let us speak plainly about Russia's true motives. Its war of aggression is not about so-called protection of Russian-speaking population, denazification, or demilitarization of Ukraine. And it is not about NATO. Russia claims it invaded Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion. Yet by its actions, it has achieved the opposite. Russia now shares hundreds of kilometers of new border with NATO. And of course, it is not about so-called security concerns of the Russian Federation. Because what security guarantees are needed for the largest nuclear-armed state in the world, whose officials have repeatedly threatened to use these nuclear weapons against Ukraine and other states. At its core, this war is about the survival of the Kremlin's authoritarian regime, which has ruled the Russian Federation with an iron grip for over a quarter of a century. It is also about imperialistic ambitions of Russia, which tries to eliminate Ukraine as a state from the political map of the world and to destroy Ukrainians as a nation. Faced with the domestic stagnation, a shrinking economy, demographic decline, and rising political dissent, the Kremlin chose war as a tool of distraction and repression. Russian justifications for the war we have been hearing since 2014 are pure lies. What Putin and his regime truly seek are consolidation of power, violence, absence of freedom in Russia and in the countries bordering with Russia. And this is why Russia is consciously continuing this war, losing every day over 1,000 of its own soldiers on the battlefield. Overall, it has already lost over 1 million soldiers. Moscow regime doesn't care about them and is ready to sacrifice even more of these very reasons. Distinguished members of the Security Council, the Moscow regime will not stop on its own. Left unchallenged, it will continue down a path of killing and destruction, aggression, occupation, rape, torture, the deportation of children, and the systematic violation of international law and the UN Charter. We will continue to defend our people, Ukraine's sovereignty, and future of our children. We seek a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, grounded in the principles of the UN Charter, and nothing less. We repeat, a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire is essential. It is the first step to halting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Peace will not come through appeasement or equalizing the aggressor and its victim. It will come through unity of the free world, determination, and justice. The UN Security Council has a critical role to play here. Its voice must be strong, its stance unmistakable. This war must end, peace must prevail, and international law must be upheld. Accountability served. Without such clarity and resolve from the Council, no combination of pressure, sanctions, or military support can deliver durable results. A just and lasting peace begins with a firm and unified message from this body. That is why we call on all members of this Council to support a French-initiated resolution calling for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. A ceasefire that would apply on land, at sea, and in the air, creating the necessary conditions for peace in accordance with the UN Charter. Now is the time for this Council to come together and to demonstrate the unity and resolve needed to help end this war. In the meantime, we are profoundly grateful to all our partners and allies. Your military support is not only a lifeline for Ukraine, it is a defense of international law and the rules-based order, where aggression is not rewarded. There is only one path to ending this war. Russia must be pushed back, economically, with strong sanctions, politically and militarily. It has to be demilitarized. This country is a threat to all of you. If we fail to stop Russia now, its armed aggression will not end with Ukraine. Others will be emboldened, and the world will become a far more dangerous place for us all. We also must make sure that existing sanctions are enforced. How is it possible that Russian individuals under sanctions, those who directly support and enable this war, are still flying freely and participating in international events as if nothing happened? What message does that send to the aggressor and to the victims? Mr. President, at last week's Security Council meeting, the Russian Federation said nothing about ending the war, not a single word. Instead, it obsessively fixated on Ukraine's internal affairs. Today, it pretends talking peace with one hand and killing innocent civilians in a sovereign state with another. This obsession is revealing Russia cannot stand Ukraine's development, democracy, language, or identity. Its goal is to destroy everything we have built. We often hear, no one will win this war. We see it differently. International law must win. The UN Charter must win. The principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolability of internationally recognized borders, and the independence of states must win. Because if Ukraine's borders are not secure, will yours be? This war is not only about territory. It is about domination, repression, and fear. The Moscow regime's insatiable hunger for occupying foreign lands exposes its deep-rooted greed. Despite Russia being the largest country in the world by landmass, it still fails to provide basic well-being and security for its own people and cannot manage its own territories, many of which are in state of decline. Do not fear Russia. Do not let yourselves be misled or manipulated by its propaganda and paralyzed by its threats, including the rhetoric you have heard also at today's meeting. The only way to end this war is to confront its cause, Russia's aggression, with unity, resolve, and action. Let us make sure that a year from now, we are not gathered here to count more victims, but to mark the restoration of peace, justice, and security, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international system. Thank you.
First of all, I congratulate Pakistan upon its successfully presiding over the Council's work. I commend you and your colleagues for your efforts in this month. I'd like to congratulate Panama as it assumes its presidency and wish it great success. Lately, Russia and Ukraine held several rounds of direct negotiations, reached some consensus on humanitarian issues such as the exchange of the prisoners of war, and made positive progress. At the same time, the crisis persists, and the end of the war is nowhere in sight. Large quantities of weapons and ammunition continue to flow into the battlefield, causing new casualties and damage to infrastructure. It worries us to see the expanding variety and range of weapons flowing to the battlefield, as well as their growing lethality and destructive power. It was reported lately that both sides have deployed combat robots on the battlefield, further showing that Russia-Ukraine conflict is increasingly becoming a testing ground for new weapons, and how war is fought could undergo dangerous changes. I wish to reiterate that weapons may win wars, but they cannot bring about lasting peace. The reckless supply of weapons to the battlefield will only intensify confrontation. prolong the conflict and cause risks of proliferation and inflict further casualties and suffering on the people of both sides and the broader region. The urgent priority is for both sides to work together to de-escalate the situation on the battlefield as soon as possible. They should maintain the momentum of talks, continue to build a consensus, and ultimately reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement. President, since the first day of the war, China has actively advocated resolving disputes by peaceful means and called on the parties to the conflict to end hostilities, start negotiations, and restore peace sooner than later. Over the past 3 years, guided by the principle for shoulds laid out by President Xi Jinping, we have worked actively for peace and pushed for talks. China will continue to work with the international community to play a constructive role for an early political settlement of the crisis. President, earlier, the U.S. representative once again spread false and slanderous narratives against China. It is completely unacceptable. At previous meetings, I responded to such accusations time and again. Since the U.S. did it again today, I am compelled to respond again to set the record straight. First, China did not start the Ukraine crisis and is not a party to it. China has never supplied lethal weapons to either side of the conflict and has strictly controlled export of dual-use goods, including drones. Second, the parties to the conflict are not under Council sanctions. China has normal trade relations with Russia and Ukraine. By doing so, it doesn't violate international law or breach its international obligations. China's legitimate rights and interests must not be infringed upon. In fact, till now, the U.S. has continued its economic and trade activities with Russia. If the U.S. is doing that itself, why it doesn't allow others to do the same? You can set fire to houses while others can't even light lamps. Is that the logic? Third, the Ukraine crisis is at a critical juncture where we see prospects and hopes for a political solution. It is not right for the U.S. to expect China to play a role in putting early end to the war, but never cease its smear and pressurizing tactics against China. We once again urge the U.S. to stop its pointless blame game, stop shifting responsibilities, and play a more constructive role for the end of the fighting and for the peace talks. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, last night, Russia launched more than 300 drones and 8 missiles that struck residential areas in Kyiv, killing at least 7 people and injuring more than 60. The United States expresses condolences to the victims and their families and demands an end to such attacks. Ukraine, a sovereign member of the United Nations, has a right to defend itself. As President Trump announced on July 14th, the United States will sell defensive U.S. weapons to NATO allies, who can then send them on. Our support for Ukraine's defense cannot be compared to the supply of arms and material to Russia, which enables Russia to continue its full-scale invasion and occupation of Ukrainian territory. Last week, we called on all UN member states to help bring the war to an end by ceasing any and all support to Russia's war efforts. We do so again today. In particular, the DPRK has supplied ammunition, missiles, military equipment, and approximately 12,000 troops to Russia. Such transfers and Russian training of DPRK troops violate multiple Council resolutions and endanger peace and security in Europe and on the Korean Peninsula. Iran has supplied Russia with ballistic missiles and UAVs, among other technology. In particular, Russia continues to use Iranian-designed Shahed drones in attacks causing thousands of Ukrainian civilian casualties. China, as its representatives have pointed out, does not directly provide weapons to Russia. Nevertheless, China has become the decisive enabler of Russia's war effort by being the most important supplier of Russia's war industrial machine. Specifically, China has provided Russia with significant quantities of machine tools, microelectronics, optics, UAV, and cruise missile technology, and nitrocellulose, which Russia uses to make propellant for weapons. If China were serious about helping to end the war, it would stop providing these critical components to Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine must negotiate a ceasefire and durable peace. It is time to make a deal. President Trump has made clear this must be done by August 8th. The United States is prepared to implement additional measures to secure peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
How is it that Russia can sit here and claim any sort of commitment to diplomacy while at the same time ramping up missile and drone strikes on Ukraine? A 6-year-old boy was amongst those killed last night by Russian missiles in Kyiv. The problem is that for all its words, the Russian state has geared itself for war. A war of aggression, a war of Russia's own making. The government bolsters its legitimacy and suppresses opposition by stoking fears about external enemies. Russia's economy is now highly dependent on military-industrial production, with almost 40% of government spending on defense, more than 8% of GDP. And the president has defined himself politically as the man who can conquer so-called neo-Nazism in Ukraine and the threat that he claims NATO poses to Russia. In reality, these are challenges of his own creation. Ukraine is not ruled by neo-Nazis, and NATO does not pose a threat to Russia. NATO merely stands with Ukraine in the face of Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion. The consequences of a militarized Russian state are not limited to the appalling tragedies felt every day by Ukraine's brave people. Russia itself has suffered over 1 million casualties as a result of its own war. The wider region is also directly dealing with the effects of Russia's aggression. And ultimately, we all are. Russia's actions are an affront to the UN Charter principles and international law, the very foundations of all of our peace and security. The consequences for the wider international system are also clear. While members of this council discuss how to bring peace to Sudan, Russia tries to leverage access to a naval base. While we discuss peace in Mali, Russia has pushed out the UN to secure advantage for its private military contractors. While we discuss sanctions to prevent nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula, Russia tries to undermine those sanctions to access military supplies for its war machine. There is another pathway. President Putin could accept the truth that there is no threat to Russia, not from neo-Nazis, not from NATO. He could choose to engage in good faith in a ceasefire and in peace talks based on the UN Charter. Until then, this state of war remains a choice that President Putin is making. We need to continue to show that there is no good outcome for Russia from its aggression, that we will remain staunch in our support for the defense of Ukraine, including through the provision of weapon systems in the face of relentless Russian attacks on critical national infrastructure and civilians. We must be vigilant in clamping down on any military industrial support for Russia, including by preventing the export of dual-use items. And we need to continue to demonstrate to Russia the economic costs of the choice it is making and not give its militarized state a lifeline that it can feed on. Ultimately, we must not let up in affirming the principles of the UN Charter. Every member state at the UN has a responsibility in this, to support a peace process that only Russia is rejecting. As President Trump has made clear, there is no reason for delay. Russia must make progress towards a meaningful peace immediately. But the world has once again seen Russia's response. That is why, as President Zelensky said, peace without strength is impossible. So it is now that we need to meet our responsibility to stand together and to demand that Russia immediately ceases its aggression and adheres to the call for a just and a lasting peace. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation is unbearable. It is unbearable because Russia, who called upon us to meet this morning to discuss obstacles to the peace process in Ukraine, last night launched large-scale airstrikes against Ukrainian cities, in particular against Kyiv. Russia launched more than 300 drones and missiles. France condemns in the very strongest terms these massive strikes, which have once again targeted civilian infrastructure and produced many victims among the civilian population. The facts are clear and damning where Russia is concerned. The primary obstacle to peace is the fact that Russia is hell-bent on striking Ukrainian cities with an intensity which only grows. Last night's attacks demonstrate yet again a deliberate strategy aiming at military escalation. Russia is aiming to sow fear among Ukraine's people. The Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the OSCE published its 7th report on the 16th of July on reported violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. That report documents an uptick in indiscriminate shelling in densely populated areas by Russian armed forces and the consequent increase in the number of civilian victims. What is hampering peace is that today, and this has been the case since the very beginning of its invasion, Russia remains entrenched in this idea of confrontation and conflict and is refusing to in any way seriously engage to bring about peace. Russia has rejected a ceasefire, the first necessary step to create an enabling environment for a peace dialogue. By way of contrast, Ukraine has tirelessly repeated for 5 months that they're ready for that ceasefire. Russia is not taking seriously the direct discussions with Ukraine that Russia itself initiated last May. Since the very first session in Istanbul on the 16th of May, Russia sent a very junior delegation with no ability to negotiate. Twice now, the Russian president rejected the proposal from the Ukrainian president to engage in direct dialogue. In May, Vladimir Putin did not go to Turkey, despite the fact that President Zelensky was expecting him. In July, when the Ukrainian president reiterated his proposal to have direct contact, the Russian president ordered mass strikes on Ukraine the following day by way of response. Russia ignores all calls for peace. Last night's strikes came at a time when President Trump set an ultimatum for Russia. He did that on the 14th of July. That ultimatum urged Russia to engage in good faith in negotiations. What's also hindering peace is that Russia never seems to balk at jeopardizing international peace and security and stability. Russia is increasing at a breakneck speed its production of drones in the factory it built with Iran's assistance. Russia is illegally equipping itself in ammunition, ballistic missiles and troops. These are coming from North Korea. More than 11,000 North Korean soldiers have been deployed among Russia's ranks on the Ukrainian front line. Russia violates the Security Council resolutions that it itself has supported and is undermining the very foundations of the international non-proliferation architecture. Mr. President, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry was clear in the report it published on the 29th of May. Drone attacks against Ukrainian civilians are crimes against humanity. Supporting Russia is to become complicit in these crimes. France urges all states to refrain from supplying Russia with the military equipment, dual-use goods, and any other items which fuel this war of aggression. France continues to call upon the Council to demand an immediate, comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire. That is the first step that needs to be taken by those that genuinely wish to embark on a journey to peace. In the immediate term, France will continue to provide Ukraine with the military support that is crucial for Ukraine to defend its people, its independence, its sovereignty and its territorial integrity in accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.